All right, it looks like the numbers are about to where we are potentially expecting, maybe a little over half. But I'll just go ahead and kick us off so we can make sure we complete this in the time that we said that we would, and we have a lot to cover. So welcome to our CEF's congressional briefing, really briefing in general, regarding shortages in the education workforce. You're going to learn a lot today. I'm very excited about the panelists that we have who have volunteered their time to just educate us on what's happening with the shortages in our education workforce at this time. And so I would be remiss if I did not start by thanking our research committee for all of the time, energy, and effort it took to put this briefing together. Just to remind folks that CEF is largely a voluntary sort of organization where we get together and we volunteer our time to provide certain services and to make sure that the education community is educated in the proper way and that advocacy is taking place on the behalf of those that we represent. And so we have two fearless leaders here with us that are going to be pretty much managing this, and that's Christy Talbot and Michael DiNapoli. So they are our co-chairs of our CEF Research Committee, and they're doing a fantastic job. And I didn't introduce myself, but my name is Emmanuel Guillory, and I am the president of CEF this year. And so I would not be able to do my job well if it was not for those like Christy and Michael who are really putting in the time, energy, and effort to make sure that what we do here is a success. And so with that being said, I'm going to introduce Sarah Abernathy, who is our CEF Executive Director. I'm going to share a little bit about her really quickly. So Sarah Abernathy, she joined the ACG team in 2016, primarily to serve as the executive director of the Committee for Education Funding. She provides CEF members with analysis of congressional administrative education budgets. She leads meetings with congressional staff and helps direct and manage the coalition's policy and networking events and outreach to the broader education community. She has close to 30 years of experience working on education and budget issues in both Congress and in the administration, including the Department of Education, the Office of Management and Budget, and the Department of Health and Human Services. For the previous 18 years, Ms. Abernathy worked on the House Budget Committee Democratic staff, most recently serving as Senior Policy Coordinator, focusing on budget issues relating to education, social services, and job training, as well as environmental issues. She graduated from Williams College and also earned a master's from the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. So with that, Sarah Abernathy, our Executive Director, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Emmanuel, for that kind introduction. And I thought I would give the 2-minute overview of CEF, but before we go to our panelists, who I know is what people are here to hear from. But for those who don't know, CEF is the nation's oldest and largest education coalition. It is nonpartisan and nonprofit and speaks together about, with one voice, to advocate for greater investments in greater federal investments in education along the continuum. And it wouldn't be a CEF presentation if I didn't have a couple charts to talk about where we are in the education funding process right now. If I could have the next slide. Just wanted to set the stage a little bit. Education funding currently accounts for just about 2% of the regular federal budget. The vast majority of the budget is for entitlement spending that goes automatically to people who qualify for those benefits like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. The remaining 1/3 is split between defense and non-defense, and just a tiny wedge goes to education. Can I have the next slide, please? But the fact is, the public supports more funding for education. When we did a poll last spring and asked, a majority of voters that we polled favored greater investments in education. And you can look at the slide and see that really for almost every category, except for Republicans, there was a majority in support of increasing education funding. And if I could have the next slide. So that is what Congress is considering doing right now. This chart shows what funding has been for the Department of Education going back to 2009. We use that year because the yellow bars show regular appropriations and the green bars show emergency supplemental funding. And in 2009 and 10, that was for funding as a result of the Great Recession. And then in 2020 and 2021, there's been emergency COVID relief funding. But if you look at the yellow bars, you'll see that really funding for the Department of Ed was actually very close to frozen for a decade. The high water mark was 2011 until 2018. And This year, Congress is in the midst right now of trying to settle on fiscal year 22 funding levels. The President and the House both put forward Department of Ed budgets of about 103 billion. The Senate has a little bit less. Next week, it's expected that Congress might be voting on the final appropriations bill. I think it's likely to be less than that, but less than these that have been projected, but we don't know for sure. And to put it into context, next slide, please. If Congress were to provide funding at the highest level that the President and the House proposed, that would still not fill the funding gap from the last 10 years. This shows funding that was provided in the yellow bars. The green line shows what it would take to keep pace with the 2011 level in inflation adjusted dollars. Every year we're falling farther behind. There's a $61 billion funding gap just to keep pace with the level from 10 years ago, which is in fact not what the goal should be. The goal should be to meet the needs today. So if Congress were to fund Department of Ed at the high level that the President requested, that would still only fill about a third of the funding gap. So that's the situation we're in right now with Congress considering fiscal year 22 funding, the President about to set up the fiscal year 23 budget. And within that education budget, we thought today we would focus on some of the ways that federal funding could help address shortages in the education workforce. And we've got some great speakers lined up, and I will turn it over to Christy Talbot to introduce the speakers. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. And as Emmanuel mentioned, I'm Christy Talbot. I'm Senior Associate for Government Relations with the American Educational Research Association. And I have the privilege today of introducing our speakers. These will be in the order in which they will present. First, Miren Algorri is an early childhood educator, small business owner, and community advocate who has been operating Little Blossoms Childcare since 1997 in the South Bay community in California, and has also had the opportunity to work with underserved children in Thailand and South Africa. As a family childcare provider, Ms. Algorri has worked so those children and their families receive the support required so they can thrive. As a union leader with Childcare Providers United, she led other providers to organize and to grow support across the state for more than 45,000 providers she helps represent. Governor Newsom appointed Ms. Algorri to the Early Childhood Policy Council Workforce Subcommittee in 2019, and she continues to voice the needs of children, families, and childcare providers. Next up is Dr. Mark Davey, who has been the Champlain Valley Educational Services BOCES District Superintendent for the past 9 years. He is a career educator in his 37th year who, before his current position, was a school district superintendent, assistant superintendent for curriculum and instruction, principal, assistant principal, and secondary social studies teacher for 7 years. Dr. Davey is one of 37 BOCES district superintendents in New York for what is officially known as Clinton, Essex, Warren, Washington BOCES. Dr. Davey earned an EDD degree in school administration from Vanderbilt University and 3 degrees from different SUNY institutions, a certificate of advanced studies from SUNY Oswego, a master's degree from SUNY Plattsburgh, and his BA from SUNY Potsdam. Next is Dr. Kari Oyen, who is the program director and assistant professor of school psychology for the University of South Dakota. She is also a licensed psychologist in the state of South Dakota. Prior to this appointment, Dr. Oyen was a practicing rural school psychologist for 10 years. Dr. Oyen is a state coordinator for the multi-tiered Systems of Support, Positive Behavior Interventions and Support Project in the state of South Dakota and sat on the Special Education Interim Legislative Committee as a governor appointee. Her research focuses on risk and protective factors that lead to student outcomes, as well as the role of advocacy in public service settings. She is active statewide and nationally as an advocate for the role of rural school psychologists. Dr. Oyen graduated from Augustana University and has graduate degrees from the University of South Dakota. And last, Megan Schneider serves as Associate Vice Chancellor for Federal Relations for the University of Houston System. Prior to working for the Houston system, she served as Senior Director of Government Affairs for the National Association of College and University Business Officers and worked in federal relations for the University of Arizona prior to that. Ms. Schneider has also served as a law clerk on Capitol Hill to Senator John McCain and for the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigation. She holds degrees from the University of Arizona and American University's Washington College of Law. So I thank our speakers, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Miren.
Hello, thank you for the introduction. My name is Miren Algorri, and I'm a family childcare provider in Southern California. I'm a second-generation family childcare provider, and I've been providing care for over 24 years. I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to share my experience as a childcare provider and to hear my insistence that federal investments in childcare must increase substantially. Family childcare providers are unique and critical to our communities. We run our childcares in our own homes and are members of the communities we serve. We often work on conventional hours to accommodate the needs of the families in our care, and we provide a more affordable solution for most families. We're often the best available option for doctors or nurses who work all hours of the day. And increasingly, many parents in this country are forced to work 2 or more jobs to get by, often overnight or early in the morning, and we're there for them as well. I have students who are certified to come in at 3 p.m. and leave by 1 a.m. in the morning. In fact, many colleagues of mine throughout California offer 24-hour childcare services. And while many daycare centers closed when the pandemic hit, family childcare providers stayed open to continue to support our community's frontline workers, even at the risk of our own health and well-being. Even now, while the rest of the country reopens, the pandemic is still very real for us. Many of the children in our care are too young to be vaccinated and too young to wear masks. We're still held to incredibly strict cleaning and public health guidelines that require us to close following exposures. And in California, we have a limited number of days we can be paid during closures. And for many, it only takes a few exposures before our closures are unpaid, which can wreak havoc on childcare providers who are already stretched thin financially. Our hard work often goes unnoticed, but this pandemic brought to light the importance of access to quality family childcare for so many Americans. I love the work I do, and I'm proud to say I am a childcare provider. But today, it's becoming increasingly harder to stay in business. And because of that, it's becoming increasingly harder to recruit new providers throughout the country. This is creating childcare deserts and leaving millions of children without the care they need. Too many family childcare providers are being forced to close their doors or are never able to open them in the first place. And today, I will focus on 2 very important reasons why. First, current federal childcare programs, Head Start, and the Child Care and Development Block Grant, they're inadequate. I'm going to focus on the block grant because that is a program that provides subsidies to the families of the children I care for. The block grants only serve very low-income families, meaning that many middle-class families struggling to pay their bills and provide for their families often don't qualify for childcare subsidies. And these leaves them with very few, if any, options. In California, where I provide care, nearly 1.8 million children under the age of 5 are in need of childcare. And yet, there are only enough childcare programs for a little over 1 million children. That means that more than 40% of children under 5 in California are without childcare. Currently, block grants only serve 1 in 7 eligible children, and the subsidy rates are too low, often less than minimum wage. For childcare to work well for families and providers, it's essential that most of the funding be reliable, not subject to annual funding decisions and shortfalls. Parents need to know their children have a safe place to learn, to eat, and to grow while they're at work. Which brings me to the second reason we see childcare deserts or underserved communities. There is no financial incentive to go into the childcare business. The block grants restrict what we're allowed to charge private pay families, those families not using the grants. These rules state that I, as a family childcare provider, cannot charge private families more than what I charge the subsidy reimbursement rate. This means that every child we take, we're paid the same low rate, even if they're a family who does not need subsidy care. This keeps our income very low, forcing us to make drastic cuts to our services, like not hiring additional help when we need it, which then limits the number of kids we're allowed to care for. These then creates more need in our community. Couple these low wages with no access to necessary benefits like healthcare, and you start to see why these childcare deserts exist. There's no incentive to open a family childcare facility when you can go get another job for yourself, nearly anywhere, that will pay more than what we make as providers. Childcare is a profession dominated by women, and many are women of color. We're used to feeling that our work is undervalued. Yet throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, we were called heroes by our politicians, and we were told our work was essential. And yet on average, we make roughly $13.50 an hour. Here in California, that's below minimum wage, and nowhere in this country is that a livable wage. So it is no wonder many of us are forced to close our doors and find other work. Also, the cost of running a childcare facility is increasing. Inflation is raising our expenses, but our income stays the same. I have to visit Costco and other local grocery stores every 4 days for food and other essentials. Prior to the pandemic, I was spending under $500 a trip. Today, I'm paying nearly $700. With costs soaring, but pay stagnant, it's increasingly hard or nearly impossible to hire help. For example, if I hire a full-time employee, I would need to take more children to afford that help. However, when they go on their lunch break, which is legally mandated to be off-site, I would then be in violation of my child to provider ratio. So what do? Do I hire another part-time person? With my own wages below poverty line, how would I be able to afford that? This issue makes expanding my care nearly impossible, and it's a roadblock for future providers to open. And that's why I'm here today. I'm asking that the federal government take action and bring forth a comprehensive early childhood education plan that funds childcare for all families who need it. Failing to do so not only hurts us as providers, but it hurts families and women in particular. The volatility of childcare availability has impacted women's ability to maintain employment during the pandemic. Just in the first few months of the pandemic, roughly 3.5 million mothers with school-age children either lost their job, took a leave of absence, or left the labor market altogether. According to an analysis by the Census Bureau, a year later, 1.3 out of those women were still locked out of the labor force. How can we expect to recover our economy if we're making it impossible for families, especially women in those families, to go back to work? To do so, requires more access to childcare. That means not only expanding access to financial help to all families who need it, but it also means investing in childcare providers and ensuring we are paid a living wage. It means funding programs that give us stability and allow those who want to expand the option to do so. We must be able to hire help and pay our workers fair wages. President Biden laid out a federal program in the Build Back Better plan, and we need help to ensure something like that passes sooner rather than later. These children cannot wait, and neither can we. If we fail to invest in childcare now, we will fail these children. Their futures rely on us and on the federal government to step up and fund programs that set them up for success. Thank you.
The next speaker is Dr. Mark Davey.
Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for the opportunity, Sarah, and to the Committee for Educational Funding for the opportunity to speak today on behalf of K-12 education and representing superintendents across the nation. I will be speaking more specifically about New York. However, the issues that we're going to be talking about today actually are prevalent nationally. So I believe that's very, very important to stress, especially as we talk about the needs of teacher education and a high quality professional teacher corps at a time when our students need the best teachers in the classrooms more than ever. We know that for the last 2 years, we've all experienced an unbelievable pandemic. We've been moving forward. And our teachers and our administrators have been called upon to work in new and different ways. And it has been challenging, but we've also made many improvements in different areas. So Sarah, let's move forward with the next slide, please. Thank you. You have a brief overview of my background, which was touched upon, and we can move forward, but I will share for the next slide that I have been in education 37 years. And I've been an administrator for the past 30 years. I have served at the elementary, middle school, and high school levels, as well as district level. And my educational career is actually balanced over the last 37 years between rural, suburban, and urban settings. So I do bring that whole perspective forward. So next slide, please. I will touch very briefly upon my statement about the teacher shortage issue, and I touched upon it as my comments began. But teacher shortages and highly qualified candidates is critical across New York, and it's also a critical need across the entire country. This is especially prevalent in all parts of New York State, and including rural areas, which I'm going to focus more specifically on today. The issues in New York State, and I'll touch upon these as well as across the country: special education, mathematics, the sciences, technology, career and technical education, and languages, but in all areas. And this shortage is more important than ever. Why? Because our students and our teachers and staff and families are reeling from the impact of this pandemic since over the last 2 years. Our schools, our teachers, our administrators are being called upon to support the heightened needs of our students, both in mental health and also to address and support their academic high standards, but also meet and fill the academic deficiencies which have been magnified. This is truly a statewide and national emergency that is gaining momentum in terms of need, and also something that I really feel it's important to bring forward as a national issue, but specifically today dealing with New York. Next slide, please. Just to share with you a little bit of information about myself and my region. I'm from upstate New York, and that's a picture of the Empire State. And you may notice we're the very northern part of New York State. You do have a summary of New York's population. And in the 2020 census, our New York State population is over 20.2 million residents. Of New York State's total population, approximately 5.9, almost 6 million of our residents live in rural areas. Specifically, the area of Clinton, Essex, Warren, Washington, BOCES, known as Champlain Valley Educational Services, borders to the north, Canada. To the east, the Lake Champlain, and to the west, the other parts of New York State. Occasionally, our three BOCES across the top are often referred to as the rooftop BOCES. And just to share with you a little bit as well, BOCES actually stands for Board of Cooperative Educational Services. And we are a regional education provider that works with our local school districts. In my supervisory district as the CEWW BOCES District Superintendent, I work with 16 different superintendents and school districts in our region, encompassing approximately 14,000 students, approximately 3,200 staff, and a square miles area of approximately 2,400 square miles. Many of you would say, well, how does this fit in with New York? Lake Placid is just to the slightly, is right on the border of our BOCES and the neighboring BOCES to the west. So definitely upstate New York. And many times when individuals look at New York, they think of merely the rural area or rather the urban area. So if we could go to the next slide, please. I will touch just for a minute on a little bit of a snapshot about rural New York, but our focus is on education. Approximately 25% of the land in New York State is used for agriculture. Just to say, from my front door to New York City, it's a 6-hour drive. With that being said, from my front door to the western part of Buffalo, it's almost a 7-hour drive. To Long Island, again, it's a 6-hour, it's 6.5 to 7-hour drive. So New York has a lot of diversity, but I just want to acknowledge that for our rural areas of New York, there are over 35,000 farms and 98% of them are family owned. From New York is a major agricultural provider, and you can see the different areas that we actually help lead the nation, as well as provide a strong agricultural base. So New York State is very, very diverse in rural, urban, and suburban. And I think it's important just to understand my supervisory district and region is in rural upstate New York. Next slide, please. To share with you a little snapshot about upstate and rural New York, in New York State has 731 school districts. And this data is from our state ed data website. The link is shown on the PowerPoint. In rural New York State, there are approximately 300 school districts, which make up geographically a majority of the state. Again, approximately 300 of our school districts belong to the Rural Schools Association, who I work very closely with and I'm honored to be a board member. New York schools as a whole have approximately 2.6 million students, K-12, over 212,000 teachers, and you can see the ethnicity of our staff. I think that's important just to provide a little perspective of New York and how we're moving forward. Next slide, please. When we look at the concerns which are very prevalent and representing our school districts across New York State as well as the nation, it's important to understand that the teacher preparation pipeline is in high need of teacher candidates. Approximately 10 years ago in New York State, we had approximately 80,000 students enrolled in our college prep programs for teacher education. Today, and that's even from conversations with our state education department, where our numbers are approximately half that. So the teacher education pipeline in New York and across the country is definitely narrowed. It is important to also understand that with that narrowing, the need of highly qualified teachers is as significant as it's ever been, if not even more so. Also, it's important to note that 10 years ago, approximately 25% of those 80,000 students came from diverse backgrounds and ethnicity. Today, of the approximate 40,000 students, 40% of them represent our diversity. So we are proud to share that there's an increase in that area. But again, the teacher pipeline is critical, and we believe it's something that really is developing into a national crisis. Next slide, please. To share with you a little bit about the teaching shortages in New York State. And it's important to understand this information was garnered and also developed based on conversations with my 37 district superintendent colleagues. So across New York State, there are 37 individuals such as myself who have a joint appointment with our BOCES and also the state education department. In New York State, and there's 2 slides of teacher shortages, of teacher areas of shortage that are being shared, and these were presented in an overview presentation at our New York State Board of Regents meeting in November. So that's November 2021. And this information is also available on the national website, tsa.ed.gov. It's important to understand in New York State, these were some specific areas, the sciences, social studies, special education, world languages. Next slide, please. As well as bilingual education, bilingual special education, career and technical education, English language arts, health education, and literacy. And to give you a practical example, 10 years ago, when we had an elementary vacancy, we would have between 100 and 200 applicants per vacancy. Today, when we have those very same applicants, we may have 10. So to have to understand the avenue now, we are in rural upstate New York. That does provide some challenges, but it's important to understand these needs are very real. I will share with you some specific information about our region and the critical needs. And I want to emphasize these needs are true across the state and I believe across the country. So let's pause for 1 minute and say, Mark, you represent New York. What's true across the country? So using that website, which is the U.S. Department of Education's website for teacher shortages, let's just mention and say high priority areas in special education. Using that website, Arizona, Texas, Maine, Tennessee, Michigan, and Florida, and that's just a sampling, and New York, all have special education as a high shortage area. Career and technical education, and these are just a sampling, Texas, Maine, Michigan, and New York. Mark, how about ELA? ELA, is there a shortage nationally for English language arts teachers? Arizona, Texas, Tennessee, Michigan, Florida, New York. Math, Arizona, Texas, Tennessee, Maine, Michigan, Florida, and New York. And lastly, how about science? Arizona, Texas, Tennessee, Maine, Michigan, Florida, and New York. And if we were to pull the data from the national database that's shown on ed.gov, I believe that these areas would be the same across the entire country. This is a very critical shortage and a growing need that potentially has strong implications for our future and our children as we move forward. Next slide, please. So let's have a little bit deeper dive just to help you understand. Now we're going to the local level. As I mentioned, I represent Champlain Valley Educational Services. That's our regional name, officially CEWW BOCES or Clinton, Essex, Warren, Washington BOCES. In our BOCES, again, very rural. We're in the Adirondack Park. We use the joke, we may have more trees than students. However, there are 14,000 students making up our BOCES and our school districts, encompassing approximately 3,200 full and part-time staff. In terms of the number of teachers, with our survey most recently completed at the end of last year, those 3,200 staff members, there were 1,420 teachers within that number. In a survey that we completed with our chief school officers, the 16 superintendents and myself, this December, we had 29 teacher vacancies. that we were having difficulty filling. We had 46 teachers within our 16 component districts and CVS who were uncertified. Many of them were working towards certification. They had bachelor's degrees. The districts and the superintendents and I were working with them very closely. However, this is a critical need when we're educating our children and we need highly qualified teachers. When we look at the other areas of vacancies, teaching assistants and aides, within our BOCES, we had 39 vacancies. We had 2 administrative vacancies. We had 71 non-instructional positions. And we had 96% fewer substitutes that were willing and able to come in to help be substitutes when our teachers were unable to come to work. Now that's also important, and I'll use one final number just to share with you. Even today, I asked our director of transportation, who works with all the regional transportation directors, a pressing need across the entire country is even bus drivers. 11 of the school districts responded in a short survey. There are 20 current vacancies of bus driver positions in 11 of our school districts that they are having difficulty filling. Again, the priority of this conversation is in teacher shortages, and it's important to understand that this is a very real issue and having meaningful impact on us. Next slide, please. So lastly, I will close with these comments and say, as I've identified and shared, CVS BOCES, New York State, and the nation, I believe, is facing a significant teacher shortage. Federal support is needed to strengthen our teacher preparation pipeline. We need to recruit diverse teachers who work in high needs fields, serve underserved school districts, especially in rural settings and urban settings. And it's important that we have a highly qualified pool of applicants and group of teachers in the field who also represent the students that they work with. I think that's very important and is essential that our federal legislators understand the critical need that this has, and it's a national issue and not merely a state issue. We need to ensure financial support for the mental health of our students and staff. Those needs are at the highest level that they've ever been. Next, I think it's very important to understand that high quality broadband for all students across our whole country is essential, regardless of the zip code. It shouldn't matter where you live if you all have access to high quality education and broadband, which that opens up. It's absolutely essential, and we've advocated that it should be considered a public resource, and very much like electricity was in the 1930s. And next, support and training for educators and school leaders is vital, including our supporting various educational initiatives and improvements developed during the past 2 years. The past 2 years have been challenging. They've been unprecedented. However, there's been a lot of innovation. There's been a lot of great things that have happened, and it's important to embrace that and move forward with a very highly qualified teacher pipeline and teacher field, but also to have the opportunity to work with our higher education partners and build those strong connections so that our next generation of teachers are not only well qualified, but they're also on the cutting edge of the best teaching practices, and that's essential. And lastly, I would like to close to say that I believe, and all of us on this call, I believe, feel as strongly as well that students are our highest priority. They are our national resource, and addressing the teacher shortage is critical to us regionally, statewide, and nationally to ensure a successful future for us all. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Davey. Dr. Davey talked about the sort of overall shortage in K-12 education, and here for a zoom in on one particular part of that is Dr. Kari Oyen.
Awesome. Thank you again so much for having me here today. I'm Dr. Kari Oyen. I'm the program director of the School of Psychology at the University of South Dakota. And again, I'm thrilled to be speaking about this really critical topic. I'll have you go to the next slide for me. One of the first things I have to say out loud, I was born and raised in South Dakota in a town of 300 people. And it is a big deal to me that we can have these critical conversations, even with those of us that are really in some rural areas. The other thing I have to say out loud is that one of my favorite quotes is a Maya Angelou quote that says, "I come as one, but I stand as 10,000." And know that today, the words that I'm speaking, some of these critical messages, they are coming out of my mouth, but they are representative of the 25,000 school psychologists who have been on the front lines, working hard every single day throughout the pandemic to ensure mental health needs of students have been met, finding creative ways to ensure that we are finding ways to help kids be successful in schools. And it also represents the over millions of, the millions of these National Association of Specialized Instructional Support Professionals, the people that are really the front lines helping students to be successful in schools. So today we're going to talk a little bit about these critical shortages and what we're really asking for Congress to do to help us try to address some of these critical issues. I'll have you go to the next slide. One of the things that I was so proud to be a part of is helping us revise our practice model for the National Association of School Psychologists. And what that really means is that we have a comprehensive role that addresses both the mental health and the academic needs of children in schools. We are highly trained in assessment, diagnostics, and intervention to really help kids be successful. And what we know about our profession is that we have a critical shortage. I'm in South Dakota right now, and I will tell you that, so I was thinking about Dr. Davey's talking about how many people are applying for jobs. I will tell you in South Dakota, there are places where no one is applying, even with critically incentivized positions. And so that really does put us at this really unique place. We really need the availability of graduate training programs. Again, as someone who's sitting as a program director, we know that that is vital to build that pipeline. We also need to have the people to do those jobs to be able to address mental health needs of kids. Our recommended ratio for the National Association of School Psychologists is 1 school psychologist for every 500 children. And in our nation, according to data that was collected by the National Center for Educational Statistics, right now we sit at about 1 to 1,381. And so we are well over the recommended ratio. In South Dakota, we are a little bit higher. So we're at 1,668 students per 1 school psychologist. So again, we know that these ratios, we need to really lower the ratios. We need to find innovative ways to really have access to high quality school employed mental health professionals to really address these needs. But we know that we're not alone. So if you go to the next slide, we know that our specialized instructional support professionals, they extend out. And some of those extensions really, they talk a lot about special education teachers. So we know that 49 states have reported a shortage of special education teachers. We know that 54% of speech and language pathologists report having shortages in their schools. We, again, have highlighted that when it comes to the ratio of school psychologists, that we're at about 3 times the rate. We also know that our school counselor rate is too high. So we know that the ratio recommended is 250 to 1 school counselor. And certainly it varies across the country, but right now they're at 482 to 1. We know 25% of schools do not employ a school nurse. And certainly we've learned that having a school nurse as a frontline responder is critical. And so we want to ensure that we're thinking about that. And again, I was just so struck by this last statistic that 82% of special education teachers and those specialized instructional support personnel from across the nation report that there's not enough professionals to meet the students with disabilities needs. And again, we're in the business of meeting needs of students. And again, I think that schools are really frontline responders in that. And so we're seeing this need, this dire gap. I'll have you go ahead and go to the next slide. We'll talk a little bit about the impact of these shortages. What we know is that it can undermine the availability of those high quality services. It can limit the school's ability to provide evidence-based early intervention. So again, I'm really struck by Miren's comments about the importance of those early educational experiences. And when we have professionals that are not able to be hired in those positions, kids aren't getting services that they need, and they're not getting access to that high quality intervention, which we know helps prevent problems later on in life. Again, reduced access to mental and behavioral health supports. And then this other note that I wanted to make sure that we highlighted is that when you have such a critical shortage, what ends up happening is that those professionals end up having such a narrow role where all they can do is perhaps some legally mandated special education practices. As school psychologists, that could mean that all we can do is test. And we're not able to provide that high quality intervention that kids need. And so what can happen is that we're not getting access to those early intervention services. We're not stopping the pipeline of failure for students. And instead, we're ending up contributing to continued failure to students. The other thing that is critical to note is that we love partnerships and we want to continue to build those partnerships with our community-based allies. But we know that there is something very special and very important about having school employed specialized instructional support professionals, including school psychologists, those people that are employed by your school that are really, at the front lines making a difference every day for students. I'll go ahead and have you go to the next slide for me. I do want to talk a little bit about the landscape of mental health and education. I love talking about this. Anybody that knows me knows that I will just wait for anybody to come and chat with me about this. But we know that 1 in 5 children have a diagnosable mental health disorder. So that means in a classroom of 25 students, 5 of them likely have a diagnosable mental health disorder. The other thing that we know is that of those children that receive services, overwhelmingly, about 75 to 80% of them receive those services at school. And the likelihood is that only about 20% total will actually receive services. And so because we have such a critical shortage of these important people, that really means that fewer kids are getting access to services. We also know that we have some pretty significant impacts of education related to COVID-19. There is some data, I put it on here from NWEA, that talks about by the end of last year, the typical student was behind where they would normally be, 3 to 6 percentile points in reading and 8 to 12 points behind in math, with those younger students faring far worse than their older peers. And so because we know that specialized instructional support professionals are critical in addressing some of these needs for students early on, we know that when we have a shortage, they're not necessarily able to get those systems in place to try to catch them early and do those intervention services and then try to get them out of that cycle of failure. I'll go ahead and have you go to the next slide for me. I have to talk about South Dakota. I am born and raised, and I am a very proud South Dakotan. And so you'll notice that I have some bison up here. Now, we like to call them buffalo, and I know that they're not called buffalo, but we call them the South Dakota buffalo. And I thought I'd give you a little context. So we talk a lot about ratios, but in South Dakota, I like to talk about square miles. And so in South Dakota, we have about 90 school psychologists that serve over 77,000 square miles. That means we have 1 school psychologist for every 855 square miles. That is shocking for some people to think about. One of my dear friends, who is a wonderful school psychologist, she drives over 900 miles per month to be able to provide children high quality services. And that's a reality for many of our school psychologists. Again, we have 11 community mental health centers that serve 66 counties. And so anybody that's great at math knows that we have 1 community mental health center for every 6 counties. We also have a really big problem with youth suicide in our state. We have a very high rate. We tend to be in the top 5 of rates of youth suicide across the nation. We also know that right now, as we're collecting that data, we're seeing a big influx in children visiting the emergency room. In particular, in our Oglala Sioux tribe, they actually declared a state of emergency in the first 6 months of 2020 because we had so many suicide attempts. And then we did have a high rate of death by suicide for our children. The other thing that I thought you should really be aware of is that we have some pretty significant educational outcomes that are troublesome. We know that in 2020 and 2021, only 14% of our Native American students were considered proficient in math, compared to 49% of our white students. 23% of our Native American students were proficient in English language arts compared to 59% of our white students. And then in science, only 16% of our Native American students scored as proficient compared to 48% of our white students. So we have some pretty disproportionate findings. We do know that our current services are not meeting the level of need. Again, we're seeing such an increase in visits for mental health purposes in our emergency rooms. And again, we want to be a part of the solution. So go ahead and go to the next slide for me. We know that there were obstacles before COVID-19, and these obstacles were not only experienced by our youth, but also the families in which they were operating. We know that these kind of risk factors have only been exacerbated by this pandemic. And then the long hauledness of us being in this pandemic time, where it is promoting a lot of isolation and disruption, financial stress, food insecurity, triggers for stress response. I will tell you, this past week, I've had so many children talk to me about Ukraine and what's going to happen to us. We're in unrest. So what are the things that we need to do as adults? Part of it is that we need to equip children with coping strategies to be able to cope with all these different demands that are coming to us. We also know that there's threats to well-being and stability. And this is my most important thing that I want you to know, is that we know that our children have underdeveloped coping strategies. And when we have schools that employ high quality mental health providers, we can help children really strengthen their coping strategies. And it turns out when we have kids that are better able to cope with the everyday demands of the home and school environment, they are more successful in school and in life. And so I'll go ahead and have you go on the next slide to tell you a little bit about some of the things we're doing. So in South Dakota, some of the things that we are doing is we're trying to partner with state agencies. We actually did receive some federal funding to do that work. So we have a SAMHSA disaster relief grant where we're doing some school-based training. We also have a voucher program where we're trying to get access for children to services. We do have telehealth equipment that we're trying to get into schools. I will say out loud that I love telehealth, but it does not replace high quality adults in the building for children in schools. I think it's a bit of a Band-Aid that can help us at least get some access to some mental health services. We do have a crisis prevention and response line, as well as using those care dollars to really promote mental health positions, and then virtual counseling, and again, crisis services. So I'll have you go ahead and go on the next slide for me. But as I'm winding up my talk today, I want to really think a lot about how we can ask you to help. And we need your help. So one of the biggest things that Congress can do right now is to pass a robust fiscal year 2022 spending bill. And in that spending bill, there is some allocations to really invest in strengthening school psychology workforce. In there, we really are taking a look at trying to address the pipeline. So again, I'm a program director, and I'm having conversations right now with my state agencies about how can we build a pipeline of school psychologists? How can we home grow school psychologists so that kids in Buffalo, South Dakota, or Lemon or Hayti, South Dakota can have access to high quality services? We also need to lower barriers to graduate training so that we can have a diverse group of people being able to become these specialized instructional support professionals. And then I also put the other bills that we have really been looking at our state, our National Association of School Psychologists. So again, it's the Improving Access to Mental Health in Schools Act, the Mental Health in Schools Excellence Programs Act, the Elementary and Secondary School Counseling Act, and most importantly, the Educators for All Act. That is a huge act that we are really trying to promote because, again, it's trying to address the pipeline of building school psychologists and other highly qualified school employed mental health professionals. So I'll go ahead and let you go to that last slide for me. I have to put a plug in. We do have model legislation to address shortages. So if you are a lawmaker and you are excited about this work and you want to partner with us, if you want to go ahead and go to our NASP online, I am the Government Professional Relations Chair for our National Association of School Psychologists. And so we're looking for innovative ways to address the shortage, to build the pipeline, to recruit and retain highly qualified mental health professionals. And again, we're just so thankful for the work of this committee that we can really be advancing this mission. We feel like we're at this precipice time. We're almost there if we can just get some funding to support this work. So thank you for your time, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to our next presenter.
Thanks so much. I think we're already well into our Q&A time, so I will try and keep this brief, but I do want to definitely talk more about how this issue is playing out in higher education. By way of bio, you heard at the beginning that I work for the University of Houston system, which I have done for a full month now. But prior to that, I worked for the National Association of College and University Business Officers, a higher ed organization here in DC that represented both 2-year and 4-year institutions, both private, nonprofit, and public institutions. So I'm certainly going to bring a Houston lens to this, but also a broader higher ed perspective at the national scale as well. If we can go to the next slide. So I want to come at this from a little bit uniquely of a place, because I think that obviously when we're talking about addressing shortages in the education workforce, I think most of you probably are thinking about colleges and universities as the people that are educating those individuals that are entering that workforce. And that is certainly true. But we are also members of that education workforce ourselves. And I think that often gets forgotten in the higher ed discussion landscape. Colleges and universities employ nearly 4 million people in the United States. So when we're talking about what it is to be a school district or a group of school psychologists, or any number of things, and dealing with shortages in your field, those are all certainly true and all things that higher ed is working to address. But when we're talking on a more broad scale about the Great Resignation period that happened during the pandemic, and just general shortages in the workforce generally in IT and HR and things like that, that is also something that colleges and universities are dealing with, both in terms of we know that we need to educate these people to put them out in your workforce, while also dealing with the fact that we have shortages of them within our own workforce. So just a little context there. And also, of course, one thing that we were fond of saying in my previous job is that when you know one college or university, you know one college or university. So hopefully you know the colleges and universities in your district really well. But I know the tendency, especially in higher ed, I think it's certainly true in K-12 as well, is to do sort of one size fits all legislation. And while I certainly understand why that is easier from a drafting and passage standpoint, colleges and universities and the students that they serve are so varied and so different. So I do also want to encourage more of a niche approach when we're talking to how to better serve different types of students to help fill these workforce gaps. But also just, as a community building tool, we need to be considering the diversity of all of the number of individuals on a college campus. So if we could go to the next slide. So I want to use HERF as a little bit of a case study, because I think this is, certainly the largest single, well, I guess it was 3 separate infusions of aid directly to colleges and universities, especially that wasn't designated for one specific purpose. If you're not familiar with HERF, I imagine most of you are, but this is the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund. That is a pot of relief aid that was first passed in the CARES Act in 2020. And 2 subsequent suffusions of funding were provided for colleges and universities, both 2-year and 4-year institutions. All told, I believe HERF aid added up to around $80 billion. Colleges and universities, quite frankly, have never seen this much money all at one time. Ostensibly, it was for COVID relief, but there was, of course, many myriad uses within that. Most of the, or at least 50% of the funding that most institutions received went directly to their students. Others went to institutional purposes, but I do really want to talk about it because I think it's a great illustration of how when you provide federal funding for these, and obviously this was not meant to be a change agent within higher ed as a whole, it was meant as COVID relief, but it really has turned out to be a change agent within higher ed as a whole, and how we serve our students and how we get them prepared to join the education workforce specifically, but more broadly, the workforce in general. And I think, it makes sense that we tend to think about these large federal infusions during emergency times. But I think when we consider how effective HERF has been in sparking so many positive changes, both for our students and for the higher education workforce, I think it's a really great example of how when you give institutions these tools, they can turn them into outcomes that really do serve the community. So speaking as the educators of future workforce professionals, which is to say, educating students on the HERF side, a lot of the monies were designated towards student success programs, increased mental health services, increased obviously physical health services, certainly COVID vaccine distribution sites, and testing sites. A ton of money went to help students addressing their more immediate needs. But we also saw longer term solutions like food pantries being developed out. And we also saw a lot of funds being directed directly towards existing student debt, which obviously is a huge relief on many students' minds. But I want to talk about sort of the things that you take a step back and you say, okay, if there were so many great outcomes that come from this, why weren't schools doing this in the first place? And the simple answer is money. It's not that we didn't know that increased money for mental health services would be a good thing for our students. It's not that we did not know that those students would have better completion and retention rates if they had increased mental health services. These things are very expensive to do, and that infusion of aid made it a lot more possible than it really ever had been before. It also facilitated for most campuses the build out of much larger IT infrastructures than they had ever had before. That was one of the primary purposes of the initial tranche of aid, was to help facilitate the transition to online learning. It's not that colleges and universities weren't necessarily interested in online prior to this. We all knew it was a good thing. We all knew there were certainly some students that preferred online learning. We know that if you are a non-traditional student, as many students across the country are, in fact, the idea of a non-traditional student is becoming a little bit of a misnomer, because there are almost as many non-traditional students now as there are what we consider a traditional 18 to 22-year-old. We knew that these things would work, but IT infrastructure is very expensive. Some of the more positive outcomes that we have had from this that we're taking into the future, that we know will help address student retention and completion rates, are things like this IT capacity that now exists to have this hybrid learning model. I was talking with one of our UH professors last week who mentioned that even though the University of Houston has primarily at all of our campuses come back to in-person learning, because we had this IT infrastructure build out during the pandemic that was made possible with HERF dollars, most classes now function on a hybrid model, which is to say, if you want or need to, you can come into the classroom and your professor will be there. But if you don't want to, the class is also being live streamed and you can watch it in real time. You can engage. The platform has now been built out so that the professor knows to expect questions from students in a virtual learning environment, as well as the students in his class. And he said uniformly from all of the classes he taught last semester and the classes that he's taught this semester, since this model was more available, every student, whether they are the most engaged, answering their hand every single question, to the student that does not say a single thing the entire semester, took advantage of both models. Some of the most engaged students chose to be remote sometimes for a lot of different reasons. Maybe the traffic was bad in downtown Houston. That happens a lot. Maybe they were working a shift and it just made more sense for them to stay at their job and do class there than to try and check over to campus. Maybe students that primarily do remote work were in a multi-generational household where they are competing for time and internet space, and it made more sense for them to come into the university. So having the hybrid model was helpful for them. There are a lot of things that we're taking out of this HERF infusion that are in the long term going to help with our completion and retention efforts. And just sort of using HERF as this case study of all of these things that, if we fund in a very short period of time, have drastically changed where higher education was 2 years, 4 years, 5 years ago. It's really astonishing to see. And from the perspective of colleges and universities as employers, this has opened up a whole new field of flexible work options that I would say 2 years ago were unheard of in higher education. The idea of remote work was a foreign concept. The idea of not having to physically be on campus every day you were working was just not something that you really heard of. And just this week, the University of Houston System Board of Regents voted on a whole new flexible suite option of non-traditional work hours, of different schedules based on, maybe you want to do a 4-10 day, maybe you want to be remote a couple days and be on campus a couple days. And all of that, sort of all of these unintended consequences that have made those individuals working at our institutions happier and have made our students happier were all possible thanks to pandemic aid. So, you know, when we're talking about what makes, you know, if really just throwing money at a problem can make it better, yes, it absolutely can in many ways. But I do want to talk about more targeted funding as well. So if we can go to the next slide. So I don't think that we can address the topic of workforce shortages without first addressing the cost of college, right? Or the cost of CTE, depending on the career path that a particular student chooses. Because even though there are plenty of really great programs out there, public service loan forgiveness is a great program. There are other programs aimed at addressing teacher and other public doctors, other public healthcare workers, loan debt specifically after they have graduated, after they've been working for a while. It's a big hurdle, right, for a student at, you know, the precipice of their education to say, okay, I'm going to enter this career path. In many instances, I know that it is preparing me to go into a lower paying field. And all of this I'm doing with the idea that at some point, 10, 15 years in the future, my loan debt may be forgiven. That's a really hard thing for someone to, you know, wrap their head around, particularly for low income students. The idea of that, you know, eventual relief, but taking on, you know, tens of thousands of debt in the meantime is understandably really hard to face. So the question there, of course, is why does college cost so much? A lot of this goes into, we get this question a lot. You all have probably wondered it about your own educations. Your parents may have said to you, or other family members have said to you, well, back in my day, college didn't cost this. This is absurd. This is colleges and universities driving up the cost of college to have big profit margins. To all of that, I say it's certainly fair to be disgruntled about what things cost. I get that, but there are a lot of things that we are now expecting our colleges and universities to do, all of which help support our students, all of which turn them out to be better prepared to enter the workforce that colleges and universities simply were not doing a long time ago, or even 10 years ago, or in some instances, even 5 years ago. Mental health services, mental wellness services did not exist on college campuses 20 and 30 years ago. Many health services have been greatly expanded on campuses in a way that they weren't. And quite frankly, students expect that if they are at most four-year institutions, that there be some sort of health center that they can engage with. From an academic sense, there are entire fields within the STEM umbrella that now exist that did not exist 10 years ago or 15 years ago that we have to hire professors for, that often have very expensive related equipment that just did not exist, in years past in higher education. And also, there is this also an evolving sense of academic institutions as a primary community in someone's life. That wasn't also always the case, but we found that completion and retention tends to be higher when an individual is engaged with their college community. In order to get them to do that, you do need things like mental health services. You need things like safe ride options. You need recreation options. You need dining. You need wellness. None of these things are, for the most part, supported by federal funding. And yet all of them are now critical to getting students out and into the workforce in a way that they simply weren't, 15 years ago. So as the industry has evolved, so has education to meet the needs of a 21st century worker that simply weren't there, or at least weren't being addressed by colleges and universities in previous eras. So I want to pivot really quickly to more specific shortages. If we could go to the next slide, and then I know we are well into our Q&A time, so I will make this quick. But when we're talking specifically about funding future workforce needs, I'm not going to talk too much about teachers shortages. I think Dr. Oyen and Dr. Davey have talked to you a lot about that. We do not have enough teachers. Before the pandemic hit, enrollment in teacher prep programs was already down. That number has just fallen even more during the pandemic. Undergraduate enrollment overall is down between 6 and 7% at four-year institutions, over 14% at community colleges. These are huge numbers that we have not seen before. So when we're talking about funding things, obviously the things that I talked about in the previous slide, funding things like mental health centers, physical wellness centers, are all very important, but we also need greater support of our minority serving institutions. We know that students in the K-12 space tend to do better when they see individuals that look like them at the fronts of the classroom and in their administration. We need to support our MSIs so that are graduating individuals that look like our minority students in the largest numbers, so that these students have a chance of success, so that maybe one day they can become teachers themselves. Greater student aid support. I don't think it's a shock for anyone to say that we are all in favor of increasing Pell Grants. Of course, the president acknowledged it in the State of the Union last night. From a higher ed perspective, we would love to see Pell Grants be doubled. They have been extremely limited in their increases over the last decade plus. Greater funding for STEM fields, and particularly STEM fields at MSIs. We know that minority identified students are historically very much underrepresented in these fields. We also know that just in terms of workforce needs, we aren't educating enough people. There aren't enough people going into these fields to meet US career demand. I was anecdotally talking with the dean of our College of Engineering this morning about something completely unrelated. And he, not knowing that I was doing this later today, mentioned to me, oh, he does a regular convening with the other deans of engineering at the other universities in Texas, of which there are many. And I guess at their last gathering, they were all lamenting that we are not going to be able to graduate enough engineers to meet the needs of Texas. Not the whole country. We're not even talking about that. We're not going to be able to graduate enough individuals to meet that just in the state of Texas. So greater funding for STEM fields, and specifically, with a DEI lens, recognizing that there are a lot of individuals that haven't had opportunities in STEM fields that historically have, and greater support of CTE programs within existing higher ed institutions. The four-year path is not the path that everyone needs to take. There are plenty of roles within the education workforce and within the workforce at large that are better served by CTE programs, but we should be taking advantage of our existing 2-year and 4-year institutions that have services in place to support those individuals as well to complete their CTE programs. The last bullet, I'll leave if it comes up in our Q&A, but I know I really want to leave time for our Q&A. So I will end it there. Sarah, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, everybody. And our research committee co-chair, Michael DiNapoli, is going to moderate some of the questions that we've been getting.
Just many, many thanks to this wonderful panel. Thank you so much for your time and your expertise. We had a few questions come in. And so just one for the entire panel. You've all painted a clear picture that there was shortages in education prior to COVID, and they have become exacerbated by the pandemic. So in your part of the education continuum, what would be the greatest bang for the buck in terms of addressing educator shortages with the tools that the federal government has? So anyone who'd like to jump in first, feel free.
Scholarships, federally funded scholarships for these programs would be great. Like I said, the idea of particular loan forgiveness for teachers after they have their degrees is great, but for a lot of people that is not enough to get them in the door. They want to know from the outset that their bill is being paid, and having sort of that support from the federal government up front before they're even incurring that tuition bill, I think would go a long way to help hopefully reverse some of those declining teacher prep enrollment numbers.
So something upfront like a souped up Teach Grant where you're committed to service afterwards.
Exactly. Teach Grant is great, but we already know that it's not funded at the levels it needs to be addressing that. There's a reason we have the shortages in the first place. It hasn't been sufficient enough to get those students in the door.
Yeah, and I just would highlight too that I've done some research on addressing some of the rural teacher shortages. And one of the biggest things that we talk about is home growing, either school psychologists or teachers. We know that if you're from the areas, you tend to stay. And so just to build on this idea of having Block grants available that you can support tuition, I also think it's important to support dollars that helps kind of hold your space in wherever you are. So if you are, operating at an educational service cooperative, and let's say you're a paraprofessional, is there a way that you can be a 0.8% paraprofessional that they wouldn't lose a lot of funding while you're going to school, that they would support you going to school, and then you could come back and be, their school psychologist or their special education teacher or their school counselor. So those kinds of things I think would be really, really critical when it comes to addressing the pipeline.
Thank you. Dr. Davey?
Sure, I'll jump in with a couple of points, and I did touch upon a few of them in my comments. However, just a few points to touch upon. For example, and as we were preparing and I was gathering information, part of the information that I came across is that the federal government's role, again, is helping, is the Teacher Quality Partnership Grant last year received $52 million, according to the information, despite being authorized for $300 million. The role of supporting teachers' preparation, their student loan debt, the financial support to assist students in the pipeline, to support diversity of candidates, and to support really a high quality teacher core. And that pipeline is essential if we're going to move forward as a nation and support our next generation of leadership and cutting edge graduates. We have to have the highly qualified teacher candidates and teachers in the classroom. And lastly, I want to commend Congress for the pandemic relief that's been provided. In many cases, it's helped our states deal with the pandemic and move forward. However, I do want to acknowledge that the preparation and support of teachers has not necessarily been funded at those high levels. They've been filling many of the other needs that are present, and I believe that the teacher pipeline, the teacher preparation and encouragement for teacher residency program and grants and scholarships and so on and so forth to really encourage the best and the brightest to go into education. It is a national crisis, and it's something that's really gaining momentum.
One thing that I think was mentioned by a few folks is the issue of educator pay. And I was just wondering if folks would just like to opine on how pay affects both recruitment and retention into the profession.
So I actually work in South Dakota. We like to be either 49th or 50th or even 51st in teacher pay. And so we actually have a blue ribbon task force that I've been following for the last few years to try to address this issue. A big part of the issue is that it costs a lot to go to college and to get that higher degree. And so not only am I coming out with a load of debt, I'm also coming out and then receiving a job that does not give me a very livable wage. I think there's also kind of this gap between, we want really, really highly qualified teachers, but we don't want to pay them because it's kind of considered in some places in our country as an expense rather than an investment. And so I would really encourage us to be thinking about how we are really investing in our future, especially when it comes to funding teachers or early childhood intervention. They do all these different research studies that talks about every dollar that you invest in early childhood services ends up saving you, this exponential amount of money. And I'm sure Sarah probably has that right at her fingertips. But there's this idea that when we invest, especially in our education, we are actually saving. We don't have to spend as much money building prisons, and we don't have to spend as much money later on in life because we've really invested that. So again, I do think that that's a concern. I think that we need to be really wise in how we're making those investments in our teachers. So one of the things that we had found in some of our research is that it's not only funding that keeps you from staying in the profession, it's also the professional development you receive, the climate that you have in the school. So then are we making sure that teachers are happy? Are we helping them invest in self-care so they don't get burnt out? So it's like this whole package of things that can really help us recruit and retain teachers and school psychologists.
So I'll jump in and share and to echo Dr. Oyen's points earlier. When I had mentioned the number of vacancies, for example, the 29 teacher vacancies, those were real vacancies that our districts were having great difficulty filling. In many cases, there were no applicants who applied for those jobs. So what the same issues that are happening in South Dakota are happening across New York State and especially in upstate New York. We do know, and some of the research that we came across is that K-12 teachers generally make approximately 20% less than similarly educated professionals. Many times, as was referenced today as well by our preschool presenter, an early childhood presenter, that early educators' pay is often falls below even that. And I believe that this is an investment in our future. The encouragement to help to not only go into education, but also to provide a wage that can sustain, a family, as well as, provide the opportunity to pay off those high student loans that many of our students are walking out of their higher ed programs with. This is a crisis, and that financial support and also reimbursement is essential. What we're finding in our region, in upstate New York, and it's true across New York State, is that our districts are actually stealing candidates from each other. They will literally make $5,000 or $10,000 more to change positions, and it's really a teacher candidate seller's market. They have if they're highly qualified, many times the individuals will move to different districts for a higher rate of pay, which then creates again those teacher vacancies. So this really is a crisis, and it's very prevalent on a daily basis. And those vacancies that I showed earlier were openings. They weren't just we had them and we filled them. No, those were openings that in many cases we were unable to fill. Thank you.
Yeah, and I mean, just to add some context to the pipeline, most colleges and universities across the country ask their students when they enter or when they declare a major, what drove you to your choice? Why did you choose the major that you chose? And historically, it has been things like, because this is what I'm most interested in, because I want to make a difference, because this is what I'm most passionate about, things like that. And by and large, we have seen a trend across the country of institutions reporting that students' answers have shifted, and earning potential has become the single highest answer at most institutions. This idea of I'm going into a job because, I think I can make a difference, or because this is what I'm passionate about, or this is really, this is what I dreamed of doing when I was 5 or 6, does not exist in our students at the earliest stages of the pipeline anymore in the way that it did. And that, earning potential really does have an impact on whether or not students are ever getting into this pipeline to begin with.
Just as a quick follow-up question, I've heard from Ms. Algorri that, early childhood educators are making $13.50 an hour in California, and I've heard about the low pay across the board from the rest of you. If there was a federal proposal, say, to provide tax credits to kind of enhance educators' compensation, I know the federal government doesn't have a large role in pay, but something like that to further incentivize folks to go into these professions, do you think that would have some sort of impact?
Yes, definitely. Having any type of support would be great, because we have seen providers continue to close their doors. And when it was just mentioned by Megan, when you ask a prospective student what's driving you to, join these programs to become an engineer, when it comes to early childhood educators, it's got to be the passion. It's never been the pay. We have been historically underpaid, underserved as early childhood educators, and the pandemic has just exacerbated these issues. So yes, the tax credits, if there was a steady funding, instead of trying to figure out how we're going to remain in business right now during the pandemic, because of the union, family childcare providers across California were able to stay in business because we were getting paid based on enrollment and not on attendance. Had not been by the investment by the government, I don't want to know how many providers would still have their doors open at this point. So yes, investment in early childhood education, it's vital, so we can continue to serve the children. And like I said earlier, family childcare is very unique, and many essential workers rely on family childcare services to continue to be a part of the workforce. And we need steady investment in our programs, in our facilities, so we can continue to serve the communities. I cannot pay an assistant minimum wage if I'm not making a minimum wage myself. Thank you.
Thank you.
I was just going to say too that in terms of tax credit, I think any innovative strategy to really address pay would be critical. I would just also mention that it's not enough to have those programs, but make them work well. So for example, right now, we have a lot of school psychologists that are applying for that public service student loan forgiveness. I am one of them. I've been serving the public for 15 years. They opened that waiver. I've applied, and I don't know if anybody's tried to call, but I was on the phone for 4 hours trying to call, and I've been a public service employee for 15 years. And then navigating the paperwork, like just those kind of systems don't necessarily help reduce barriers. And so again, when we're trying to address a pipeline, we want to make it so that it's enticing, it's easy to navigate these spaces, and it makes it so that you really want to be a part of this. Like, I'm investing in the future of our children by doing this work. So I guess that's just my side note. Don't call the number either.
No, yeah, there's a lot. It's a point well taken. And I know we're coming up on the end of our time. So just, quickly, Congress is hopefully wrapping up the fiscal year 22 spending bill. Just what is one take home message you would like Congress to hear as they're working on these important programs that fund the educator workforce and our students and children across the country?
My takeaway message would be that we do have a mental health crisis in our nation, not only for our youth, but for our adults, and really by anybody that's been impacted by the pandemic. And I really think that we have an opportunity to really equip the people that are frontline responders in schools. By addressing this shortage, we are able to really help our most vulnerable populations, our children, for the future. And I think now is the time to act.
Thank you. Anyone else want to jump in quickly?
Sure, I'll just provide one comment. Many years ago in the late 50s, Sputnik was a national emergency in education. All of a sudden, the federal government stepped in and said, this is a national emergency and crisis. We're behind internationally. I believe that we're approaching that type of situation nationally. That's how critical this issue is. And the federal government's support and a bipartisan approach, I think, is needed, but to strengthen our teacher pipeline, to support the recruitment of our teacher field, and really meet the needs of our students, including mental health, which is so critical, but also the academic deficiencies that have developed. It's more important than ever, and we don't want to wait too long, because it's going to be very hard to recover, and it is more challenging every day.
I would just say funding works, and we've thrown out any number of programs and in different types of tax credits and incentives. And there are a lot of things that you can put funding towards, but across the board, it works and it will help. And we are historically behind, and we really have a lot of work to do catching up in the K-12 space and the higher ed space. And if we don't start tackling it soon, we may be too far behind to ever fully catch up to where we need to be.
I want to echo on the support needed when it comes to mental health for the children and mental health for the early childhood educators. If we don't understand what mental health is, if we are not taking care of our mental health, we cannot turn around and support the children and identify issues and make sure that they're getting the services and the resources. You cannot continue to pour out of an empty cup. So yes, mental health is vital for the children, for the families, and for the educators who are working with the most vulnerable population, our young learners. So I want to echo that, and it comes with making sure that the educators have their needs met so they can best serve the children and the families across the nation. Thank you.
Thank you all again. With that, I would love to turn it back over to Emmanuel and Sarah.
Well, just to wrap us up here, I want to thank the panelists once again for sharing your time, your expertise with us. We've definitely learned a lot. I thought it was very beneficial. Thank you again to our research committee and our co-chairs for putting on a wonderful briefing. And I wanted to remind everyone that's still with us that we will have this recording posted on the CEF website. So you can always go back, listen to any great tidbits that we learned today if you need to jot down notes. And I'm sure that our panelists are willing to take any additional questions after this is over if you were to have any. So with that being said, thank you to everyone who has joined today. And Sarah, did you have anything else you want to add before we conclude?
No, just I appreciate the expertise we have here. We had more questions than we could get to, and we will send something out to all the folks who registered with some links to some extra resources and background materials. So we'll be happy to continue the dialogue that way and hope that we can continue to be a useful resource on education funding. Our website has a lot of information, and our Twitter, which is @edfunding, also tries to share information about education funding and education generally, things going on in Congress and the administration, if you want to follow. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you all.